So this is what constitutes as micro these days. The Game Boy Micro, the last member of the Game Boy lineage. An interesting one to go out on. This was during the reign of the Game Boy Advance, but also, the end of the reign, because this was after the Nintendo DS launched. Nintendo showed a lot of, hesitancy with the DS, just the fact that the DS had an entire extra slot just for Game Boy Advance games. I think that was kind of their, insurance card right there. Well, if the DS fails, it's just a part of the Game Boy line. This wasn't our actual, successor to the Game Boy. No, not at all. I mean, you look back at that, how weird is that? How it's just like, oh yeah, it's backwards compatible with our previous system. We needed to put an entire extra damn slot on here just to make way for backwards compatibility, but it's backwards compatible. It's like it's backwards compatible with a line of systems that has a completely different name, branding, all of that stuff. The compatibility with the Game Boy Advance felt very much like Nintendo wasn't sure that the DS would succeed, so they put that in there as kind of like just a, just a way to make the failure sting a little less. Because that was their first dedicated handheld system that wasn't titled Game Boy. So this was a huge risk for them. But we all know that went down. The DS became literally Nintendo's best-selling handheld at the time. And the Game Boy had no more reason to exist, With the Game Boy Advance, that kind of lasted a few extra years. But it was obvious the DS was the future. But Nintendo still tried a little something. Game Boy Micro released in 2005. And is generally considered one of Nintendo's, not biggest failures, but, kind of like, it's a little bit of a mediocre failure. I've seen bigger. It sold around 2 to 3 million units, so, not like it didn't sell anything, but, it was a Game Boy system. These things were meant to sell 80 million units. I think it just kind of came down to the point and just overall value of owning one of these things. I mean, what was it? So the Game Boy Micro was basically a Game Boy Advance with a ton of features stripped out, smaller, no clamshell design from the Game Boy Advance SP, which proved to be very, very popular. This very much seemed to be kind of a hip, modern, fashionable variant of the Game Boy, kind of a Game Boy that you'd be proud to whip out during lunch. I mean, comparing it to the Game Boy Advance SP, the Game Boy Advance SP is supposed to be incredibly compact, even, especially when it's closed. This is how it's gonna be in your pocket. And even when it's closed, the Game Boy Micro is so much smaller. I don't think it's much of a coincidence that this kind of came out around the time that the iPod Mini and iPod Nano were hitting the scene. Nintendo's ad campaigns around this time, especially when the Wii launched, really did feel like they were kind of taking notes from Apple in terms of minimalism and just trying to be cool and, marketable to the casual crowd. And this is something you can imagine, people playing in commercials like those old iPod commercials with the silhouettes on the colorful backgrounds. This is what it felt like. And it definitely felt like that because this has interchangeable faceplates. Hey, express yourself. Well, this is me right here. So with the faceplates and the tininess of it all, this really felt like oh, this is a Game Boy that you buy to be cool, rather than oh, here's the reason to buy it. Because let's be honest, what was the reason to buy it outside of just looking cool? The Game Boy Advance SP is always kind of seen as the definitive Game Boy Advance, or Game Boy in general, really. I mean, you have the clamshell design, which protects the screen. You have, all the buttons you're gonna need. A beautiful backlit display, which, there are two models of the SP. One is the original that launched with, kind of a lesser lit display, but this one is, most people refer to these by the model number. Well, not most people. But either way, this one is AGS 101, which means it has an improved backlight. And yeah, this thing gets pretty bright. You have all these features, and then the ability to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. The Game Boy Micro can only play Game Boy Advance games. I guess the ability to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color really does just add to the size of this, because we try to fit this in, I mean, the cartridge physically can fit, but it does not, connect. Which I at least think the ability to play original Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games would have at least added to just the functionality of this thing. The Nintendo DS and DS Lite could only play Game Boy Advance games as well, so, you know, if you were gonna market this right alongside the DS and DS Lite, it's at least something where it's just like, okay, well, like, the DS and DS Lite can only play Game Boy Advance games, at least the Game Boy Micro can play all Game Boy games in general. Yeah, no, it can only really play Game Boy Advance games, and when you take the price of this thing into consideration compared to a DS, you know, there was no question what you should buy. This thing launched at $99.99. That's usually kind of an attractive price point for something that's supposed to be like, oh, budget, but kinda cool. But for only $50 more, the Nintendo DS. The DS launched at 150 bucks, and this was only $50 cheaper and could only play Game Boy Advance games, while the DS had all these extra features, you know, internet connectivity, 2 screens, a touch screen, a microphone, straight up more buttons, bigger screens, and of course, the ability to play Nintendo DS games, and also knowing that that system is going to be supported for a couple more years with, you know, brand new releases. The Game Boy Advance was, you know, kind of like older news at that point, not saying that it wasn't selling, but more so it was obvious that it's just like, hey, you know, you could buy this system with not as many new games coming out for it, or you could just pay $50 more and get a Nintendo DS where you get all the Game Boy Advance games and whatever new Game Boy Advance games are releasing, and all the DS games that are releasing. And then in addition, you know, they were still selling the Game Boy Advance SP. This itself launched for $100, like when it released in 2003. So by like 2005, when this was out for $100, like I don't know of the price of this right off a hand in 2005, but it was obviously less expensive than this. So it's obvious, like if you were gonna get a Game Boy Advance, you should have gotten the Game Boy Advance SP. And if you wanted to spend a little bit more money, you know, you could just save up a little bit more and just get a Nintendo DS. So I think that paints a pretty good picture as to why the Game Boy Micro failed in comparison to, you know, the Game Boy Advance SP and the Nintendo DS. It was just in kind of this weird area where it just didn't make much sense from a value proposition. It has less features than the Game Boy Advance SP, which was cheaper to buy, and it has less features than the Nintendo DS, which was only $50 more. So yeah, as a consumer, not much reason to buy this. As a Game Boy Advance aficionado, ooh, it's pretty cool. It's just one of the neatest things to play Game Boy Advance games on. Yeah, the screen is smaller than the Game Boy Advance SP and the original Game Boy Advance and DS, DS Lite, all of that, but because it's smaller, the games just look so crisp on it, and it has like the brightest screen of a Game Boy. And it goes even brighter. If you hold L and move the volume rocker up and down, yeah, it can get pretty damn bright. And you know what? I lied. It does have a feature the Game Boy Advance SP doesn't have. A headphone jack. I still don't get that. But here's another incredible annoyance with this thing. It has its own charging cable. You know, it does not use the Game Boy Advance SP's charging cable. No, it uses its own. In addition, where is the link cable port? Yep, that also requires its own adapter. It's not like you can't do it, it's more so that you just need a specific adapter to do it with the Game Boy Micro. So, you know, with all these extra little things, it obviously feels like the Game Boy Micro was kind of designed in a vacuum, like, you know, hey, this isn't supposed to be a replacement or just like a successor to the Game Boy Advance SP, rather just something for people who just want to play a couple Game Boy Advance games and play them in style. But a lot of things just ended up being kind of a nuisance. Like, it's just like, yeah, it's really cool and it looks really slick. Like, this is genuinely a great design. But at what cost, man? The faceplates are really cool, and the you know, the front comes off incredibly easy, which is something I cannot say about changing faceplates on the new Nintendo 3DS. Damn, Nintendo's just not the same anymore. The buttons have a great feel to them. They're small, but they're not too small at all. I think the main problem would be the shoulder buttons, but even then, I do kind of feel like the shoulder buttons are not that uncomfortable. I honestly kind of prefer something like this in comparison to the Game Boy Advance SP. You know, kind of having your hands just kind of crunched in together like this, you know, because of just how compact the overall, like, length of the Game Boy Advance SP is, you know, just kind of holding it like this. It's not my favorite thing. This just having a bit more of a longer form factor I don't know, it feels a little better. But, you know, the shoulder buttons themselves do feel like they take a little more effort to push, though. And I haven't even mentioned the best version of the Game Boy Advance SP, the Famicom Special Edition. This was released for the anniversary of, you know, the Japanese version of the NES, released in 1983. And this is based on the controller of the device, which was this golden, just like shiny thing that just looks gorgeous. I find it really interesting because this version was released in North America, which feels odd to me considering it's kind of like, well, this is based on a Japanese controller design. Like, what does the design mean to most consumers in 2005? But it is such an awesome version of the Game Boy Micro. And yeah, you know, it is a faceplate, so, you know, you could swap this on the regular Game Boy Micro. I don't know why you would, because it's just like this version still has the burgundy-ass design on the back. That just wouldn't make any sense on here. And playing games on the Game Boy Micro just feels cool. Like, it is just a different feeling experience. It kind of feels like you're playing the games in a new light. And I think that's where the value comes in with the Game Boy Micro. It feels like such a unique experience. It's a really fun way to play those Game Boy Advance classics. I just wish they kind of had more of a reason for this thing to exist other than just kind of being like the iPod Nano of the Game Boy line. The Game Boy Advance library is so vast, I'm sure Nintendo kind of thought it's like, oh, well, we'll just have this like kind of hip version of it, and you know, you just throw this in your pocket with a couple of games and boom, you're golden. But you know, that obviously wasn't gonna happen. You know, you were either gonna get this or a DS. In the end, I feel like the Game Boy Micro was a really cool just thing. But that's all it really was. I think if you have a big Game Boy Advance collection or you're just nostalgic for the Game Boy Advance era, I think this is a really fun thing to buy and collect and all that stuff, and, you know, kind of as a secondary Game Boy Advance. As much as I think the Game Boy Advance SP is the definitive model of the Game Boy Advance, you know, like, the games look more fun on a Game Boy Micro screen. That screen is so much smaller, which means, you know, hey, some games may not work as great for it, you know, games with a lot of tinier text, but overall, like, I just feel like it's more fun to play those games on a Game Boy Micro screen. So, damn it, I salute you, Game Boy Micro, and the void you left in Nintendo's heart.